have you ever had the experience of recognizing that a talent or skill of yours or a trait or an interest is very much shared with a narcissistic parent? Maybe you have a musical gift, or you're drawn to something really specific like boat building or a specific form of art, or you're a great photographer or a love of cooking. Maybe you're interested in the profession and really good at it that a narcissistic parent did. Medicine, teaching, nursing, engineering, pick something. You may actually genuinely be interested in what a family business does. And perhaps it's even simpler that you just look just like your narcissistic parent. You're a ringer. A person looks at you and might even be shocked at the resemblance. This is a tricky situation. Ironically, the narcissistic parent who already stole so much from you in terms of autonomy, individuation, your sense of self, and your interests, hopes, aspirations, skills are either devalued, ignored, not cultivated, or taken over by the narcissistic parent, who then becomes the abusive stage parent and drinks in the validation and screams at you. It gets confusing as you get older, and the active rebellion and the attempt at individuation you may undertake can be that you try to turn away from anything your parent does. Let's say your parent was a musician, and despite you having a natural affinity for music, you're like, I want nothing to do with this. You may love and be drawn to medicine, and again, really be naturally good at it, but you refuse to take on that field because it's a profession they do. And this may be because you don't want to give them the satisfaction, or maybe you're afraid of their criticism, or you just want to be something separate from them. There's also the confusion that comes from a childhood where you may have been indoctrinated into preferences or evolved the fawn response of being what the parent wanted you to be. So you just would, that was how that would show up for you. And because you are fighting to be loved, it may very well be that you are now a great tennis player or piano player or dentist, but you still remain unclear whether you do what you do or excel at it, excel at what you do is because of it's your actual interest or it's their interest, and this is how you got loved. And the fact is, there isn't much you can do about your appearance, but I have known folks who are almost ashamed of their looks because they are so reminiscent of the narcissistic parents. Even if the narcissistic parent was a knockout, the person just didn't want to look like them. Now, this is where the entire realm of autonomy and individuation becomes very complicated for people with narcissistic parents, because some of this stuff, it's our traits, it's our genetics. We may have quirks, skills, preferences, looks that come directly from the narcissistic bloodline. We may be really good at stuff that the narcissistic parent or grandparent or aunt or uncle are or were really good at. You may have a stubborn streak that is actually quite similar to the narcissistic parents. And until you understand it, narcissism, it can make individuation very difficult because these things, these traits and these interests, these qualities may be inherent to you. And so you're, in essence, when you're trying to run away from things that are part of you, but you're running away from them because they're the narcissistic parents, but they're also who you are, this is where it gets tricky. Part of healing is to know that some of these things and abilities in you did come from that narcissistic parent or system. That you may come from a line of artists or musicians or people who are really good with their hands or natural athletes or natural scientists or writers or cooks. Denying your very nature because it is something that is there in the narcissistic parent is also denying your sense of self. Obviously, that's not good for you. But understanding that your affinity and your abilities for these activities or qualities doesn't mean that you are being the parent, but to allow these things to grow in you on your terms and pay attention to how you feel about them. It is a very complicated, trauma-bonded balancing act because you may have trouble reconciling the you when you were a child that told a parent, I'm going to be a fill in the blank. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a farmer. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to be a dentist, just like you. Or simply, I'm going to be just like you when I grow up. a sort of fawn response that evolved to keep you attached and connected to a narcissistic parent who just didn't differentiate from you. You had to be them to be loved. There has to be a sort of evolution away from what was fawning and what is yours. It's for this reason that lots of survivors feel as though they waste time figuring out what they want to do, and recognize that once you understood the narcissism thing, or just grew to dislike the narcissistic parent more, you would fight against anything they stood for. Fight, just like the fawn response, is also an involuntary response. And then one day, you have to land on that uncomfortable place of, some of who I am is going to be genetically and inextricably linked to who that narcissistic parent is. Some of it, yes, biological and genetic, some of it environmental. Because maybe you grew up around the things they did. It might be art, it might be music, it might be science, it might be, garage workshops, it might be cooking, it might be sport. It took time to win that parent over as a child and then push back against what they were. And then perhaps to give yourself permission to know that, yes, I do have some similar gifts and interests, but I'm not them. And that differentiation takes a long time. And that's why many survivors of narcissistic parents can often have the experience that they're late bloomers. It can also be uncomfortable since people will look at you and frame it as, oh, you look just like your old man, or holy, wow, you're a great cook just like your mother, or wow, you sing just like your grandfather, or good for you for carrying on the family tradition of law. But that wasn't what you were doing. Or some of this stuff you're doing, you can't help that they did it, like what you look like, or that you like to cook, or you learn from them. But you can break these cycles, and many people do. It's just not easy. And healing and thriving mean that someday you come to a place that you can recognize that your gifts and skills and interests do come, some of them, from a legacy place. And despite that legacy narcissistic person, parent, grandparent, whoever it was, harming you emotionally and psychologically and not allowing your true you to develop, you can get to a place where you recognize that this sort of family inheritance, not of money, but of affinities and skills and even your physical appearance or abilities, is something you can make your own. You can recognize where it comes from, but also know that you are not defined by the subjugated and selfish space in which you were raised or even exposed to these things. I've seen a lot of people who are so gifted at something, but it happens to be the thing that dear old mom or dear old dad or dear old someone else in the family did. And people would run away from it. They'd run away from the very thing that they were just maybe even better than the parent as. And they would spend years running away from it, but it was their nature. I mean, this is where it gets tough. While nobody genetically becomes narcissistic because they have a narcissistic parent, some of these things like quirks and traits and the shape of your eyes and certain abilities do seem to be analytic thinking or artistic abilities or spatial thinking. Some of that's going to get carried through. And you would have grown up in a space. And even it may very well be that the narcissistic parent's workshop or studio or office was a forbidden place, that you could not go in that place. So it's not even like you grew up getting to participate in it. If anything, you were told, don't touch that, stay away from that, but it pervaded the household. So this is very, very hard work for people who had a narcissistic parent, who shared an interest, skill, ability of yours, and that you not only end up recognizing that is your gift and actually your interest, but then simultaneously having to differentiate from them can be a real crisis. And this can be much, much more pronounced if that narcissistic parent was sort of identified as the best ever. So like your narcissistic parent was not only a doctor, but was considered the one who pioneered a specific kind of a surgical technique, or your narcissistic parent was a writer who wrote a really important book or novel, that when that level of excellence is there, that can be even noisier because you may say, I'm never going to be that. And your parents whatever it is, genius or skill or whatever, was often touted around. So that was one reason you almost felt scared to see your parent for what they were, and in fact might have even revered that parent until you really saw it clearly. And would have felt that, well, I like to write too, and I'm actually pretty good at it, but I can't write like them, or I can't paint like them, or I can't run like them. That you can't be like them, and they're up here. That can also be something that thwarts it for people of narcissistic parents, and the narcissistic parent ain't going to help, because they're very well going to say, okay, well, you might want to rewrite that or redo that. And so again, that child, you'll forever feel like that child showing up with the drawing you made saying, what do you think of it? A good parent would say, it's beautiful, when their child shows up with a picture. But we often have to prove and reprove ourselves with these parents. But this carrying of that trait and still having to differentiate might be some of the hardest work. But I've talked with people who've gotten there and said, I know where some of these gifts, I know where some of these skills, and I know where some of these interests come from. And I'm able to see myself as separate from that parent and understand that this is sort of a quirk of my family system, these interests, and I happen to be good at them, but I can leave that toxic part of them behind. It can happen. It's not easy, but it is possible. Thanks again.